Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the Petrovs. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, we're going to be taking a look at this move pawn to d6. And the main focus of this video is going to be alternative moves to the main line. We're going to be looking at knight c4 and knight d3, and we're also going to be looking at the move knight to f3, knight takes e4, and the so-called Lasker variation beginning with this move queen e2. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So for starters, why do people try alternatives like this? What is the point of trying an alternative like this? Well, what you're trying to do is it's an alternative. So you're trying to get your opponent into a position that maybe he plays a lot less, or maybe he's a lot less familiar with, and you're trying to get yourself into territory that hopefully you've studied a lot more and territory that you're very familiar with, even though the objective assessment of the position is that it's very, very close to equal, if not completely equal. You're playing for very minimal advantages in all three of these lines, in knight c4, knight d3, or queen e2. So really it's just you're trying to get your opponent into territory where he's less familiar, but you've basically got to draw in the bag. You've got an equal position, and you're not going to be worse. There's just no way you're going to be worse. If you just take a look at this main line Lasker variation, after queen e7, d3, knight f6, the main point of this position is that when queens finally do come off the board, like say after knight c3 or bishop g5, knight c3 is one of the main moves here. Knight c3 was actually tried in Nakamura versus Guri in London in 2012, where Nakamura actually won. That game continued queen e2, bishop e2. And by the way, queen e2 just eventually is going to be forced because Black doesn't really want white to have the option to keep queens on the board with bishop e3, and also if white ever plays the move bishop g5, queen e2 is going to be a forced move regardless. So we have bishop e2, and then we're going to have pawn to g6 is the main line, and that main line occurred in the game Carlsen versus Karyana in Wickensee in 2018, and that ended in a draw. So that should be considered completely equal. If they continue with bishop e7, which is the move that happened in Nakamura versus Guri in London in 2012, Nakamura got a very, very slight edge here. He castles h3, h6, rook e1, rook d8, knight d4, bishop f8, bishop f3, c6, and then b4. White was very, very slightly better, but this isn't really anything to write home about. But he was able to eventually convert this into a win. So it's possible to get these very slight advantages in these positions with just a little bit more space, a little bit more development, a little bit more of a comfortable position in this totally symmetrical pawn structure, and just go on and try to play for a win from here. And this is something that a couple of top flight grandmasters do, especially when they're in tournaments and they're in a tournament situation or a match situation where they're okay with getting a draw with white, just with some prospects or some chances where they might be able to get a win. They're okay with drawing the position, the majority of the time, as long as they get that occasional win. Now, Carlsen is interesting because Magnus Carlsen as white has actually tried all three of these ideas. So if we go back to just looking at these two knight retreats, this knight c4 and this knight d3, Carlsen has tried both. And what's interesting about it is they can actually transpose into each other. He's had some very interesting success against the normal number 2 player in the world, Fabiano Caruana, who had the black pieces against Carlsen many times when Carlsen played this move knight c4 or knight d3. And so the idea that Carlsen has is after knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7, which is basically forced, he would bring this knight back to e3. And of course the main idea is this knight is focusing on the square d5. And the main thing that Carlsen is trying to make happen is he really is trying to make this line happen with knight c6, knight d5, knight d4, knight e7, knight e2, with the idea of knight d5. Now what's interesting is this position is still completely equal if black manages to find the correct move, which Karyana eventually did find, which is knight d4, which should just lead to a completely equal position. And in fact, they did draw after knight to d4 when they played in London in 2018. But a couple of times, Karyana, and actually from the different move order, it was after, instead of knight c4, it was the move knight d3. And like I said, these moves, interestingly enough, can transpose. The game continued knight e4, queen e2, queen e7, knight f4. So the knight is aiming at the same square, it's aiming at d5. So it can be the same variation if black continues with knight to c6. which did happen in one game. It went knight c6, knight d5, knight d4, and we had this basically identical sequence of moves. And then after knight d5, of course, knight d4 here is going to be completely equal. But, Carlsen got lucky, and he had his opponent play c6. And then we have bishop e2, cd5, knight c3 is just kind of just decisive advantage white. And he managed to get this position against Cariano once. So he kind of tricked him. And he managed to get a major advantage with the white pieces by playing this goofy move order. But again, objectively, this position is just completely equal. If after knight takes e7, knight e2, we have knight d5, and then simply knight d4 is total equality. But also, just after knight to f4, the position is completely equal if we just retreat knight f6, which is what Ian Nepomniachtchi did in the World Championship match against Magnus Carlsen in Dubai in 2021. He just retreated, and now it's basically like a Lasker variation. You can see these similarities. We have the knight coming back to f6, and it's the same as the Lasker. We have knight f6, we have d4, we have knight to c6, we have c3, we have d5, and there's just nothing here. Eventually the queens are going to come off. It does favor white a little bit because white has an extra tempo. And there were a few little intricacies that happened in this game. Magnus actually managed to threaten to do some stuff on the dark squares. He managed to make some interesting threats, but Nepomniachtchi responded very accurately with all of this. It's actually very easy to get in trouble in positions like this, like surprisingly easy. But Nepomniachtchi played everything just about perfectly and managed not to get into a bad place and managed to hold everything together, playing, very aggressively on the king side and exchanging pawns exactly when he needs to. If you let this position sit, like even just this position right here, you can actually get into a significant amount of trouble with the black pieces. It's really not that hard. Even though the position looks symmetrical and it doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on, we do have this good bishop versus this bad bishop, and it is very possible for black to end up with an unfortunate placement of pieces where his knights and his bishops don't have any real forward movement. So these are the types of subtle advantages that you can play for, even in these completely symmetrical pawn structures where queens have been exchanged early. And we see these types of positions in both these knight d3 lines, these knight c4 lines, and of course the knight back to f3, knight takes e4, and queen e2 lines. And of course Magnus Carlsen is one of the best players in the world at taking advantage of these subtle things that are going on in the position where you can possibly still get a major advantage, even though objectively in these completely symmetrical positions there shouldn't really be anything there. And on top of that, add to the fact that there are these chances that people will try to play something complicated in a couple of these lines, and you can get these quick major advantages in the early opening. It gives white a lot of incentive to try this, especially if the worst thing that'll happen is you'll end up with a completely equal position, and a position that should be fairly simple to draw. But that's basically why you would try to play one of these three moves. That's why you would try to play the Lasker variation here with queen e2, or why you would try to play a move like knight c4 or knight d3. You're content with getting a draw if black plays perfectly, but you also are leaving open the possibility of having a major advantage if black plays this theory incorrectly, or just getting an advantage later through some sort of very subtle nuance in the position that will allow you to get a major advantage. So anyways, that's basically how you're going to play these three sidelines, and of course mainly how you would play the position like the Lasker variation or stuff similar. So I hope you liked content like this, and I hope that I gave you some new ideas that you can use in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.